I found the doll at a tag sale, hidden under a pile of worn stuffed animals and Barbie dolls with bad haircuts. She was tall, about 18 inches, and had curly black hair that turned bluish in the sunlight. Her eyes were green, and her lids opened and closed when tilted. She reminded me of the dolls my grandma used to collect. As a kid, I spent weekends at her house and always begged to play with them, but she'd say they were only for display. Now, at 25, I was buying a porcelain doll at a yard sale, fulfilling that childhood wish. Odd, I know, but I felt like the doll was meant for me. She even looked like me, minus the Victorian dress, replaced with blue jeans and a t-shirt. After taking her home, I cleaned the dirt marks from her face and arms. I stared at her for a while, unsure of what to do next. I could play with her now. There was no one to stop me, but I realized I didn't know how anymore. I wasn't a child, and playing with dolls didn't come naturally like it used to. I thought about just placing her on a shelf and leaving it at that. I should have. I really wish I had. But instead, I started tilting her from side to side, like a child might pretend a toy is walking. I made her walk over to a small elephant figurine on my side table and, without thinking, I had her kick it over. Fortunately, the living room was carpeted, so the elephant only lost an ear. Stunned, I quickly set the doll down on the couch and picked up the figurine, cradling it as though apologizing. I couldn't explain why I had done that. I set the elephant back in place and took the doll to my room, placing her on the rocking chair beside my bed, and then left to make dinner, pushing the odd moment out of my mind. That night, when I went to bed, I only gave her a passing glance before getting under the covers. There she sat, peacefully on the chair, her eyes closed. I sat up. Closed? I tried to remember if they'd been shut when I set her down. Her lids could have easily closed as I carried her. I probably just hadn't noticed. I lay back down and turned off the light, telling myself it was late and I was tired. I drifted off without much trouble. I've always been someone who falls asleep easily. Hours later, I woke up suddenly and groggily looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. I had 4 more hours before my alarm would go off. As I turned over, I realized I needed to use the bathroom. I turned on the light and groaned as my eyes adjusted, but once they did, I found myself staring straight into the green eyes of the doll. Squeezing my eyes shut and opening them again, but her eyes still stared back at me. They had been closed. I knew that. I walked over to the chair, picked the doll up, and tilted her forward so her eyes closed again. Then, I tilted her back, and they opened. I repeated the motion several times, trying to understand how they could have opened on their own. There was no breeze in the room, the windows were shut, and the chair hadn't moved. I couldn't explain it. I set her back on the chair, ensuring her eyes were closed, and went to the bathroom. When I returned, I checked her again. Her eyes were still closed, just as I had left them. I smiled, reassuring myself that I had probably opened them earlier and was too tired to remember. Climbing back into bed, I turned off the light, but my eyes kept drifting to her face. To my horror, I watched as one eye slowly winked open and then shut again. I shook my head, convincing myself that I must be imagining it. I turned off the light and burrowed under the covers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I curled up, trying to ignore the creeping sensation. I was an adult, after all, and I wasn't about to let a doll frighten me. I stayed wrapped tightly in the blankets until I started to relax, feeling the weight of sleep returning. And then I heard it, a soft creaking noise, the sound of my rocking chair moving back and forth. Slowly, I turned toward the chair, too afraid to turn on the light. The moonlight was just enough to see by. The doll was still seated there, staring at me as the chair rocked. At first, I thought the chair was moving by itself, but then I saw a pale figure crouched next to it, pushing it back and forth. I froze. The figure stood up. A little girl, around 6 or 7 years old, wearing an old-fashioned nightgown. Her black hair was tied in pigtails, and her pale face had dark circles under her eyes. She wasn't solid, I could just barely see through her. She wasn't alive. The girl tilted her head at me, as if inviting me to play. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I watched as she picked up the doll and hugged it close. How could she hold it? She shouldn't have been able to, but she did. Could she touch me too? The thought sent a shiver through me. She was just a little girl, but something about her felt deeply wrong. She took a couple of steps toward me, thrusting the doll forward. The doll's eyes began to blink wildly, and its mouth cracked open, unleashing an eerie, shrill laughter. I screamed. The little girl's face twisted into a grin, revealing sharp, bloody teeth. She threw the doll at me, laughing the same laugh that had come from the doll's mouth. As the doll flew toward me, its teeth snapping, I knew I had to do something. If the girl had come with the doll, maybe destroying it would send her away. I caught the doll and held it at arm's length, feeling it struggle in my grasp. I had to act fast. I dashed to the living room, barely keeping the doll under control as it twisted in my hands. I threw logs and newspapers into the fireplace and lit them. The doll fought harder, but I pinned it under my knee as I fumbled to get the fire going. The girl's laughter echoed through the hallway, growing louder with each second. Finally, the fire roared to life. I yanked the doll off the floor and hurled it into the flames. Its porcelain face shattered, and its cloth body ignited. A blood-curdling cry filled the house, the sound so loud it felt like it was coming from everywhere. I clutched my ears and crouched down, waiting for it to stop. Through the corner of my eye, I saw the little girl standing in front of the fireplace. She was more transparent now, her face contorted in pain. She reached for the doll, but her hands passed right through it. As the doll burned, the girl's body began to blacken, as though she too was burning. She turned to me, anger in her eyes, and started moving toward me, but her steps were slow and heavy. Her body continued to turn black with each step. I stood up, backing away, terrified. When I tripped over the couch, the girl leapt toward me, but before she could reach me, she dissolved into black smoke and disappeared. I sat there, trembling, waiting for her to return. After what felt like hours, I finally moved toward the fireplace. The flames had burned out, leaving only the shattered pieces of the doll. I gathered them up, not caring about the heat, and took them outside. I buried the pieces in the far corner of my yard, hoping that would put an end to it. It's been an hour since I buried the doll, but I still feel like I'm being watched. I don't know if she's really gone, and every now and then, I swear I can hear her laugh. I had gone through a pretty rough divorce a few months ago. For the 2 years my ex and I were married, most of our nights ended up turning into shouting matches and insults. We were always so loud that we got several noise complaints, and eventually we were given an ultimatum: get it together or we'd be thrown out of the building. Eventually we ended things and she got most of everything. The house belonged to her family, along with nearly everything inside it. All she let me take were my clothes, some photos, and my dog, Riley. I was short on money at the time, but luckily, a friend let me stay at his place for as long as I needed. While I was there, I searched for a better-paying job to help me get my life back on track. My search led me to an opening for a campus security guard at the local community college. When I arrived at the interview, I learned that it was a night shift job. I wasn't too sure about taking it at first, but my bills and growing debts weren't going to pay themselves. Needless to say, I started the next night. The campus was a decent size, both in area and the number of students. It included 14 educational and auxiliary buildings. The security office was by the south entrance, located on the second floor of the parking garage. 2 senior security guards, James and Darnell, walked me through my responsibilities. Every night, I had to do 2 full sweeps of the campus, checking all the buildings and monitoring the security cameras. My shift ran from 9:30 p.m. to 6 a.m., after which I'd take the bus home. The job itself wasn't bad. I even formed a bit of a friendship with James and Darnell since our shifts overlapped for a short time. By midnight, they'd both leave, and I'd be alone on campus. It was surreal how a place that was usually bustling with students could suddenly be so silent and empty. There were typically a few cars left in the lot from evening classes, and sometimes an instructor or staff member would work late, but those instances were rare. Most nights, I hardly interacted with anyone besides my coworkers. When things were quiet, I'd sometimes read a book or listen to spooky stories on my phone during breaks. Admittedly, those stories would sometimes make me feel uneasy about being alone on campus at night, but I got used to it. It helped pass the time until my next round of checks. I never found anything unusual, aside from the occasional item left behind by a student, which I'd returned to the lost and found. My main job was to ensure no one was hanging around after hours. After each circuit, I'd return to the office to review the security footage in case I missed something. There were a few screens showing the areas with the most daytime activity. One for each parking lot, one for each building floor, and one for the administrative office. The pay was decent, and after a while, I was able to move out of my friend's house and into a small apartment. I even started saving up for a used car. Felt like my luck was finally turning around. Then, I had the scariest experience of my life. It was around midnight, and like usual, I was left alone. The campus was completely deserted. It was summer, so the night was warm, and I was starting to sweat a bit in my security uniform during my first round of checks. After completing the circuit and finding nothing of note, I returned to the office and checked the camera feed. At first, there was nothing on any of the screens, but then I saw something strange on the one showing the south lot near the office. A large shadow was moving across one of the lamp posts, back and forth. It didn't seem like it could have been from a bird or animal. It was too big. I figured someone might be parked just out of the camera's view. So I went out to check, but there was nothing. If someone had been there, they would have left some trace. Footprints, a car driving off, but I found nothing. I even scoped out the rest of the lot, but still nothing. I sighed, irritated at the thought of someone messing with me. The rest of the night was uneventful. Sleeping during the day had become a routine, but my cheap couch was far from comfortable. On top of that, my apartment's AC had stopped working, so I wasn't getting much rest. The heat made it harder to sleep, and when I showed up for my next shift, I had maybe 4 or 5 hours of sleep. Coffee only helped for so long. By the time it got really late, the cool office and quiet campus made me drowsy. Sleeping on the job wasn't allowed, but I would sometimes take brief naps to recharge. I set my head on the desk and immediately fell asleep. I was jolted awake sometime later. Something felt wrong, like an alarm going off in my head. Rubbing my eyes, I checked the monitors. My eyes narrowed when I saw something on the camera feed for the south lot. There, standing under one of the lamps, was a person. They weren't doing anything, just standing still. I couldn't make out any details, but they had long black hair and seemed abnormally tall, almost reaching the light. The camera was still recording, so whoever it was, they were still out there. A cold, creeping dread came over me. My body reacted instinctively, as if sensing danger. But I knew I had a job to do, so I went outside to investigate. I reached the lot in under a minute and saw the person standing exactly where they had been on the camera. They had their back to me, head bowed forward. As I got closer, I realized this figure was unnaturally tall and thin, and they were wearing a dirty white dress. I called out, asking if they needed help, but there was no response. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. I reached out to touch them, but the moment my hand made contact, I recoiled. Their skin was burning hot, like touching a stove. I stepped back, shaking my hand in pain, and that's when they moved. Slowly, they lifted their head, and I froze. As they turned around, I started backing away. What I saw wasn't human. The body was, but the head, it was that of a goat or ram. Black fur contrasted against pale skin, and its eyes glowed red like embers. Flesh hung from its curved horns, and as it moved toward me, it let out a deep, bone-chilling roar. I turned and ran. I raced back to the office, the sound of its footsteps pounding behind me. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I quickly called 911, telling them something was on campus. They sent someone over, and I waited in the dark, heart racing. Felt like forever before I heard a knock. The police arrived, and I cautiously opened the door. I explained what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They probably thought I was crazy or on something. I played the footage for them, showing the thing on camera. At least they weren't going to arrest me for making a fake emergency call. But with the intruder gone, there wasn't much they could do. They left, and once again I was alone. Only this time I wasn't just alone, I was terrified. I didn't feel safe, not with the possibility that thing was still out there. I wasn't taking any chances. I stayed in the office, door locked, until my shift ended. Halloween was always a big deal in my town. Every house participated in a competition to see who could scare the most kids, and they also vied for the title of giving out the best candy. It was a fun tradition, and this year my friends and I were finally old enough to go trick-or-treating alone. I spent the entire day getting ready with my friends, Ashley and Sherry. I was dressing up as a vampire, Ashley as a witch, and Sherry as a werewolf. I had just finished putting some fake blood around my mouth as the final touch when Ashley suddenly gasped. I asked her what was wrong, without taking my eyes off the mirror. She told us that it was snowing. This was not good news. Snow on Halloween was an even bigger deal than Halloween itself in my town. It had only happened once in my lifetime, about 10 years ago when I was too young to remember. But that didn't matter. Every year leading up to Halloween, the grown-ups would warn us about how snow on Halloween was a bad omen. They made sure we all knew the rules to follow if it ever snowed on Halloween. The rules were simple. If it snowed on Halloween, any trick-or-treater wearing a mask had to take it off before receiving candy. If anyone refused to remove their mask, they weren't supposed to be given candy, and nobody was to speak to them. We didn't know why the rules existed, but I didn't care much since Sherry was the only one among us wearing a mask. I teased Sherry about her mask, joking that she'd have to take it on and off all night. Ashley chimed in, laughing that if Sherry wasn't quick enough, we'd leave her behind. Sherry just rolled her eyes at us, but she wasn't too bothered. Since we were staying at Ashley's house that night, we expected her mom to give us a brief reminder about the rules as we headed out the door. Her mom wasn't the nagging type, so I didn't think much of it. My own mom, however, was another story. I could practically sense her calling me before my phone even rang. As soon as I answered, I cut her off, reassuring her that Sherry was the only one wearing a mask and that we knew all about the rules. I told her we wouldn't talk to anyone who didn't take their mask off and wrapped up the call quickly, telling her I'd see her the next day. I chuckled as I hung up, thinking about how parents always worried too much. Once we made sure our costumes were perfect, we headed out into the snowy neighborhood. Our plan was to start at the house next door and work our way around the neighborhood. The inner streets had some seriously creepy-looking houses, and we wanted to save those for when it was dark to maximize the scare factor. As we walked, Ashley wondered aloud whether Josh and the other guys would be out trick-or-treating too. She had a not-so-secret crush on Josh, but she always denied it. At the first house, I rang the doorbell and cheerfully called out for candy. The night went on smoothly, with Sherry quickly learning to pull off her mask every time she was asked. I had to give her credit. She put the mask back on after every house, even though I would have given up after the 4th or 5th stop. Around 9 p.m., we approached the last house in the neighborhood. This house was famous for giving out 2 full-sized candy bars to trick-or-treaters at the end of the night, just to clear out their stash. We were excited and ran up the steps, barely noticing the group of kids leaving as we arrived. The woman at the door greeted us warmly, commenting on our great costumes and inviting us to take 2 bars each, but only after the ones wearing masks took them off. I looked over at Sherry, who was already pulling off her werewolf mask. Next to her stood another kid I hadn't noticed before, dressed as a scarecrow. His burlap sack mask had crooked stitching for a mouth and jagged holes for eyes, which sent a shiver down my spine. I quickly grabbed a Twix and a Milky Way, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. Sherry grabbed her candy, and we nudged her to keep moving. As we turned to leave, Sherry reminded the scarecrow that he needed to take off his mask if he wanted candy. I suddenly blurted out a reminder about the rules, which caught Sherry off guard. She quickly realized her mistake, apologizing for forgetting about the rules. She hadn't lived in town as long as Ashley and I, so the rules weren't as ingrained in her mind. We looked nervously at the woman at the door, hoping she would dismiss the situation as a harmless mistake. Instead, terror crossed her face. She clutched the plastic pumpkin to her chest, whispering that we needed to run before slamming the door shut and locking it. Without wasting a second, Ashley and I grabbed Sherry and bolted down the steps. We didn't know why the woman had reacted so fearfully, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As we rounded the corner, I glanced back and screamed when I saw the scarecrow's mask. He was right behind us. I yelled for my friends to run faster, my heart pounding in my chest as we sprinted toward Ashley's house. The sound of straw rustling behind us grew louder, and I knew the scarecrow was gaining on us. Finally, we reached Ashley's front porch and scrambled up the steps. Ashley reached for the doorknob, but it was locked. She fumbled for her key while Sherry and I pounded on the door, desperate for her mom to let us in. The rustling sound grew closer. Just when I thought we wouldn't make it, Ashley managed to unlock the door, and we all tumbled inside. She quickly slammed the door shut and locked it, turning off the porch light to make it seem like no one was home. As we collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, I noticed a piece of paper on the side table. It was a note from Ashley's mom, explaining that she had been called into work for an emergency shift at the hospital, leaving us alone. Before we could react to the news, a loud bang echoed from the front door. The scarecrow had caught up, and it was angry. I suggested barricading the door, and Ashley and I quickly moved a side table in front of it while Sherry dragged over a chair from the living room. Suddenly, something hit the window above us, and the doorknob rattled. Sherry asked if there could be more than one of them, but none of us had any idea. I urged everyone to move away from the door and led the way upstairs to Ashley's room, figuring it would be safer to get off the ground floor. We started pushing her desk up against the door to keep it shut. Sherry began sobbing, apologizing profusely for her mistake, saying she hadn't realized what she was doing when she spoke to the scarecrow. I reassured her that it wasn't her fault and told her we would be okay. A loud bang interrupted us as the bedroom window shook violently. I looked over and saw the scarecrow's mask pressed up against the glass. Ashley screamed, wondering how it had gotten up to the second floor. I had no answer but knew we needed to hide immediately. I led them to the closet, and we all huddled together behind Ashley's hanging clothes, pressing ourselves as far back against the wall as possible. The banging on the window and the door continued relentlessly, alternating between the two as if the scarecrow was trying to break in from every angle. Sherry wept beside me while Ashley rocked back and forth in fear. I silently prayed, promising to never skip school or slack on my chores again if we could just survive the night. The assault went on for what felt like hours. At one point, I swore I heard the sound of straw rustling just outside the closet door, and I was convinced the scarecrow was about to find us. But eventually, the banging stopped. We waited in silence, barely daring to breathe. After several long minutes, I checked my phone. It was 12:05 a.m., November 1st. We had made it,